The iron wheels screamed a protest against the cold, a sound that sliced through the vast, white silence of the high plains. Inside the passenger car, the air was thick with the smells of damp wool, coal smoke, and the faint, nervous sweat of too many bodies pressed too close together. Maribel Clark kept her hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white. She stared out the window, but the glass was a milky pane of frost, blurring the world into a smear of gray and white. This was it, the end of the line, or close enough to it, Sable Fork. The name itself sounded brittle, like a twig snapping under a boot in a frozen forest. It was a place to start over, a place where no one knew the name Cole Ransom or the promises he had broken. A place to be free, if freedom could be found at the edge of the world. Across the aisle, a man sat with a little girl curled against his side, asleep. He was broad-shouldered, his face weathered into a map of sun and sorrow. He had the quiet stillness of a man who spent more time with land than with people. He had not said a word for 100 miles, but Maribel had felt his presence. A solid, grounding weight in the swaying car. The little girl, who could not have been more than 4, had a tumble of dark hair and a smudge of something sweet on her cheek. In her sleep, she sighed and burrowed deeper into her father's canvas coat. The man's hand, calloused and wide, rested gently on her back, rising and falling with each small breath. He caught Maribel looking and gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod before turning his gaze back to the frozen window, his jaw tight. Further down, near the rattling door connecting the cars, another man stood. He was Apsaluk, his profile sharp and noble against the gray light. He wore a mix of clothing, a government-issue wool coat over buckskin leggings, his long black hair braided and neat. He had not sat for the entire journey. He stood sentinel, his dark eyes fixed on the land rushing past. He was not watching the scenery. He was reading it. Maribel had seen him trace the path of a frozen creek with his eyes, his expression unreadable as the train tracks cut a black, unhealing scar across the pristine snow. He was a man watching his world being sliced in two, and his silent witness was more powerful than any shouted complaint. The train gave a sudden, violent lurch, throwing passengers against each other. A collective gasp filled the car, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle shot. Then another. Glass shattered somewhere up front. The little girl woke with a frightened cry, and her father instantly pulled her down to the floor, his body a shield over hers. "Stay down, Rosie," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scrambled for cover under the hard wooden seats. Maribel's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible. A man with a red bandana covering his face kicked open the door, a pistol in his hand. "Your valuables." "Now," he snarled, his voice muffled by the cloth. Suddenly, a bullet tore through the window just above Maribel's head, showering her with glittering shards of glass and ice. She flinched, a small cry escaping her lips. The world narrowed to the round, dark mouth of the bandit's gun as he turned toward her. Time seemed to slow. The rancher across the aisle moved with a speed that belied his size, in one fluid motion. He was on his feet, shoving a carpet bag into the bandit's knees and sending him off balance. At the exact same instant, the Apsaluk warrior moved from the other end of the car. He was not a blur of motion, but a study in economy, each step precise. He did not rush. He simply arrived. As the bandit stumbled, Tahan's hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist and twisting. The pistol clattered to the floorboards. A second bandit appearing in the doorway raised his rifle, but Tahan was already moving, using the first man as a shield. Elias Shaw scooped up the fallen pistol. He did not aim to wound. He fired once at the wooden door frame next to the second man's head. The splintering wood was message enough. The second bandit hesitated, his eyes wide above his own bandana. Outside, the gunfire had intensified, the sharp reports of rifles mixing with the deeper boom of a shotgun. The outlaws had misjudged their prey. The conductor and a pair of armed guards were putting up a fight. The bandit in the doorway cursed, grabbed his partner, and they scrambled back off the train, disappearing into the swirling snow. The immediate danger had passed, but the train was slowing, its rhythmic clatter grinding down to a groaning halt. It sat dead on the tracks, steam hissing into the frigid air like the last breath of a dying beast. The car was a mess of overturned luggage and terrified people. The little girl, Rosie, was crying softly. Her father, Elias, went to her immediately, murmuring words of comfort as he checked her for any injury. Assured she was only frightened, he stood and looked across the aisle at Maribel. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were filled with a grim light. Maribel could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She touched her temple, her fingers coming away with a smear of blood from a small cut where the glass had grazed her. The Apsaluk warrior, Tahan, had already retrieved his rifle and was peering cautiously out the broken window, scanning the landscape. He moved with a quiet purpose that calmed the frayed nerves in the car more than the conductor's flustered reassurances ever could. Elias knelt by the spot where the first bandit had fallen. The man had been hauled off by his partner, but he had left something behind. A worn leather wallet lay on the floor. Elias picked it up. It felt wrong to go through another man's possessions, but these were not ordinary circumstances. He opened the flap, searching for a name, an identity. Instead, a folded piece of oilcloth fell out. He unfolded it. It was a map, crudely drawn in charcoal, but the landmarks were unmistakable to a man who had ridden this land his entire life. There was the sharp peak of the Wolf's Tooth, the winding line of Cottonwood Creek, and there, circled several times, was a small, shaded area marked with an X. Elias's blood ran cold. It was Crow's Teat Spring, the artesian well that was the lifeblood of his ranch. The reason his cattle survived the dry summers and his family had water through the bitter winters. His land, his water. "What is it?" Maribel asked, finding her voice. She had moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her fear. Elias did not answer immediately. He ran a thumb over the charcoal X, a cold dread coiling in his gut. This was no random train robbery. This was not about cash boxes and jewelry. This was a message. This was a reconnaissance mission. A name surfaced in his mind, a name that had become a curse in this valley, Baron Hale. A man who bought up land, starved out smaller ranchers, and diverted entire creeks to feed his own massive herds. Hale's Rocking H Ranch bordered Elias's property to the east, and for the last year, Hale's foreman had been making offers for the Shaw homestead, offers that felt more like threats. Elias had refused every one. He would not sell the land his father had settled, the land where his wife was buried. He looked up from the map, his gaze sweeping over the other passengers, then landing on Tahan. The warrior had turned from the window and was watching him, his expression impassive, but his eyes knowing. He had seen the map, too. He knew that water was worth more than gold in this country. It was life, and it was power. Tahan gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement of the trouble that had just boarded their train. The conductor came bustling through, his face pale. "The engine's damaged," he announced, his voice trembling slightly. "And the telegraph lines are down. We are stranded until they can send a crew from Cheyenne. There is a small outpost a mile up the track. Sable Fork. There is a saloon, a post office. We can take shelter there. It is the only option." A collective groan went through the passengers. A mile. In this wind, in this snow, it might as well be 100. Elias carefully refolded the map and tucked it into his coat pocket. The leather of the bandit's wallet felt greasy in his hand. He looked at Rosie, now quiet and watching him with wide, trusting eyes. He looked at Maribel, a stranger in a strange land, her face pale but her chin held high, a smear of blood drying on her temple, and he felt the weight of the coming fight settle on his shoulders. The cold seeping through the broken window was nothing compared to the chill that was spreading through him. Baron Hale wanted his water, and he had sent armed men to scout the prize. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that blotted out the world, promising a long, dark night. The fight for Crow's Teeth Spring had just begun. The mile-long trek to Sable Fork was a battle against the wind. It howled down from the mountains, driving snow so thick it was like walking through a blinding white curtain. Elias carried Rosie, her small body wrapped in his coat, her face tucked into his shoulder. Maribel walked beside him, her head down, her thin traveling cloak offering little protection against the biting cold. Tahan moved ahead of them, not breaking a trail so much as finding one, his steps sure and steady where the others stumbled. The silence between them was as heavy and cold as the air they breathed. Elias had not spoken a word since he had shown Tahan the map. The knowledge of what it meant sat between them, a shared and unspoken burden. Sable Fork was less a town and more a temporary scar on the landscape. A squat, log-built station house, a saloon with yellow light glowing weakly in its windows, a post office, and a few other rough-hewn buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the immense, indifferent wilderness. The wind shrieked around the corners of the buildings and rattled a loose timetable sign on the station platform, making it clang a mournful, irregular rhythm. As they stepped onto the relative shelter of the platform, Elias set Rosie down. The little girl immediately clung to his leg, her eyes wide as she took in the strange, new place. Maribel pushed the hood back from her head, her hair damp and clinging to her face, her cheeks flushed red from the cold. The dress she wore, a simple gown of dark blue wool, had been meant for a wedding in a warm church. Now, it was creased and damp, the hem stiff with ice. She shivered, a tremor that ran through her entire body, but she stood tall, her gaze fixed on the clanging sign as if it held some profound message. Elias saw the shiver. For a moment, the hardened shell around him cracked. It was a simple, human instinct. He shrugged out of his heavy canvas coat, the one still warm from his own body heat, and without a word, draped it over her shoulders. The coat was huge on her, smelling of leather, wood smoke, and the clean scent of the pines. It was a gesture of pure, unthinking decency. Maribel turned to thank him, surprised by the kindness. But the man who met her gaze was a stranger. The brief connection they had shared on the train was gone. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes distant and cold. He had already turned away, his attention focused solely on his daughter. Rosie, however, was not looking at her father. Her gaze was fixed on Maribel, who was now enveloped in the familiar scent of her father's coat. The little girl's brow furrowed in concentration. She looked from the woman's dark hair, now escaping its pins in soft tendrils, to the gentle curve of her cheek. It was a child's logic, a puzzle of memory and sight clicking into place. She tugged on her father's trousers, her small voice clear and piping in the momentary lull of the wind. "Daddy," she said, pointing a small, mitten-clad finger. "She looks like Mommy." The words, so innocent, so simple, struck Elias Shaw with the force of a physical blow. He froze. The wind could have scoured the flesh from his bones and he would not have felt it. His breath hitched in his chest. Sarah. The name was a ghost on his lips, a wound in his soul that had never healed. It was not a perfect resemblance. Not truly. Sarah's hair had been a shade lighter, her eyes a different blue. But there was something in Maribel's posture, a quiet strength, a resilience in the set of her jaw that echoed the woman he had loved and buried on a hillside overlooking the Crow's Teeth Spring. Rosie did not remember the details of her mother's face, only the feeling of her, the impression of love and safety. And in this stranger, this woman in a wedding dress arriving on a ruined train, she had found an echo of that feeling. Elias took a half-step back from Maribel, his movement sharp and involuntary, as if she had burned him. The warmth he had just offered her was gone, replaced by an Arctic chill. The walls he had carefully built around his heart over the past 2 years were not just rebuilt, They were fortified with ice and stone. He looked at Maribel, but he did not see her. He saw a ghost, a painful reminder of everything he had lost. His voice, when he finally spoke, was flat and devoid of any emotion. "We should get inside," he said, his words directed not at her, but at the space beside her. He scooped Rosie into his arms, holding her so tightly she grunted in protest, and strode toward the saloon without a backward glance. Maribel stood alone on the platform, wrapped in a dead man's memory and a living man's coat. The hurt was sharp and confusing. She had done nothing, said nothing. One moment there was a shared danger, a flicker of camaraderie, a simple act of kindness. The next, she was a pariah. She watched him go, her pride a fierce, hot thing in her chest. She would not call out to him. She would not ask for an explanation. She had come west to escape a man who thought he could own her, and she would not begin her new life by begging for the kindness of a stranger. A few townspeople had gathered, drawn by the unscheduled stop. May, the proprietor of the saloon, a woman with a face as weathered as the landscape and eyes that missed nothing, watched the exchange with a flicker of understanding and sadness. She saw the pain in Elias Shaw's retreat and the proud defiance in the young woman's posture. Young Jed, the postman, a lanky youth with a perpetually curious expression, just looked bewildered. Whispers began to circulate, carried on the wind like snowflakes. The poor widower, that girl, arriving alone, dressed like a bride. Tahan had observed it all from the edge of the platform, his presence so quiet he was almost part of the landscape. He saw the child's innocent words strike Elias like an arrow. He saw the wall of grief slam shut in the man's eyes. He waited until Maribel finally moved, her step stiff as she followed the path toward the saloon, as he fell into step beside Elias, who was waiting for them at the door. Tahan spoke, his voice low and for Elias alone. "Do not let the dead take the heart of the living with them." It was not advice, it was a statement of natural law, like saying water flows downhill. Elias's jaw tightened, but he did not reply. He pushed open the saloon door and ushered them all into the welcome blast of warm, whiskey-scented air. The saloon was the town's heart. It was crowded and noisy, filled with stranded passengers and concerned locals. May immediately took charge, directing people to warm spots near the pot-bellied stove and pouring hot coffee. She gave Maribel a long, assessing look and then a small, encouraging nod. "You can sit here, dear. Get the feeling back in your fingers." Maribel took the offered seat, sliding Elias's coat from her shoulders and folding it neatly on the bench beside her. She would not wear his pity. Jed, the postman, had managed to rescue the mail sack from the train and was now sorting letters on a corner of the bar. Feeling important. "Got a whole mess of mail here," he announced to anyone who would listen. "Most of it for the railroad, some for the ranches. Been holding this one for weeks. Addressed to a Mr. Cole Ransom, care of the Rocking H Ranch." Maribel's hands, which had been wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, went still. The name dropped into the room like a stone into a silent pool. Cole Ransom. Here, working for Baron Hale. The world tilted on its axis. She had traveled 2,000 miles to escape that name, to escape the man who had promised her marriage and then revealed a character as cold and cruel as the Wyoming wind. She had thought she was running toward freedom. Instead, she had run straight into the heart of his new territory. Her past was not behind her. It was waiting for her. Just over the next rise, she looked up and her eyes met Elias Shaw's from across the crowded room. He was watching her, and for the first time since his daughter had spoken, he seemed to truly see her again, a flicker of curiosity in his guarded eyes. She quickly looked away, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. The fight for water was not the only storm gathering over Sable Fork. The name Cole Ransom hung in the air of the crowded saloon, a ghost no one could see but Maribel. The warmth from the stove could not reach the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The storm outside was no longer just a storm. It was a cage, trapping her here with a past she had traveled half a continent to escape. The prospect of spending the night, or several nights, in the public room of the saloon, surrounded by strangers and whispers, was unbearable. Elias Shaw seemed to reach the same conclusion, though for different reasons. He watched the snow piling up against the windows, a grim set to his jaw. He could not stay here. His ranch, his stock, they needed him. More than that, the map in his pocket was a burning coal, a constant reminder of the threat gathering at his borders. He looked at Rosie, her head already drooping with exhaustion, and then his gaze fell on Maribel. It was a brief, impersonal glance, the kind a man gives to a stray calf he must either shelter or leave to the wolves. Leaving her was not an option, not after she had been a target on the train. "My ranch is a few miles from here," he said, his voice low and rough, directed at the table between them rather than at her. "It is not much, but it is shelter from this. You and the child cannot stay here." It was not an invitation. It was a declaration, a practical solution to a logistical problem. Maribel felt a surge of prideful resistance. She wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own. But one look at the swirling blizzard outside and the weary slump of her own shoulders told her that would be foolish. She was a traveler, stranded and alone. She needed shelter. "Thank you, Mr. Shaw," she replied, her voice steady and formal. "We would be grateful." Tahan, who had been standing near the door, a silent observer of the room's currents, gave a single nod. "I will walk with you," he said. It was not a question. He knew, as Elias did, that the men who had stopped the train were not far, and they were not the only danger in a Wyoming blizzard. The journey to the Shaw homestead was a descent into a world of white chaos. Tahan led the way, his knowledge of the land a palpable force against the storm's fury. He did not follow the wagon road, which would be lost to drifts, but cut across the low hills, guiding them through stands of pine that offered some meager protection from the wind. He pointed out the treacherous, snow-covered patches of a frozen marsh, his hand gestures economical and clear. He read the landscape like a book he had known his entire life, while for Elias and Maribel, it was a blank, hostile page. Elias followed with Rosie bundled in his arms, his trust in the absolute warrior absolute. The ranch was hunkered down in a small, protected valley. A sturdy log house, a large barn, a blacksmith's forge, and a few smaller outbuildings stood dark against the snow. Smoke curled from the stone chimney of the house, a fragile sign of life in the immense desolation. Inside, the main room was spare and clean, dominated by a large fieldstone hearth where embers still glowed. It was a man's home, functional and devoid of soft touches, yet it was solid and safe. The lingering scent of pine and old leather hung in the air, but beneath it was a stillness, the quiet echo of a life that was no longer there. While Elias saw to the fire, Rosie, exploring her familiar surroundings, stumbled near the wood box and scraped her hand on a splinter, letting out a sharp cry of pain. Before Elias could even turn, Maribel was there. She knelt beside the little girl, her voice soft and calming. "Let me see, little one. It is just a little scratch." She examined the small wound with a practiced eye, then went to her traveling bag. She produced a small tin of salve and a clean strip of linen. With gentle, efficient movements, she cleaned the scrape and applied a small bandage. Rosie, distracted by the calm attention, had already forgotten her tears and was now staring in fascination at the neat white bow Maribel tied. Elias watched the scene from the hearth, his face unreadable. He had seen a woman's competence, a simple act of care performed without fuss or drama. It was a small thing, but in the quiet, empty spaces of his home, it felt significant. Later, as Maribel prepared a simple meal from the supplies Elias provided, he noticed her glance at the ranch ledgers he had left on the small kitchen table. "The numbers for the feed costs seem high for this time of year," she commented idly, stirring a pot of beans. "Even with the hard winter." Elias looked at her, surprised. "My father was a merchant," she explained, answering his unspoken question. "I kept his books for 10 years. You learn to see the story numbers tell." For the first time, a flicker of something other than grief or suspicion crossed his face. A grudging respect. This woman was not what he had assumed. She was not a helpless bride, nor was she a ghost. She was a person of substance, with skills forged in a world far from this one. The fragile peace was broken when Tahan appeared at the door, a silhouette against the driving snow. He had been gone for over an hour. Circling the property line like a silent guardian, he stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat, his expression grim. "Hale's cattle are moving," he said without preamble. "They are pushing a large herd toward the north pasture, toward the spring." He looked directly at Elias. "My people have a story about crow's teat. They say the water is the blood of the earth. If a man is greedy and tries to stop its heart, the earth takes its revenge. The grass dies. The soil turns to dust. The land becomes stone." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It was happening. Hale was not just scouting. He was making his move. "I have to see," Elias said, pulling on his still damp coat. "I will come," Tahan said. They moved out into the storm again, leaving Maribel and Rosie in the small circle of warmth and light cast by the cabin's fire. The wind tore at them, but they pushed on, their shared purpose a shield against the cold. They found it a half-mile from the house, a new fence, 3 strands of barbed wire, stretched taut between freshly cut pine posts, gleamed with a malevolent coldness in the gloom. The wire was a new and brutal invention, a way to carve up the open range and claim what had once belonged to all. This fence ran directly across the old cattle trail, the public access path to the spring. It was a declaration of war. As they stood there, 2 riders emerged from the swirling snow, their rifles held ready across their saddles. They were Hale's men, their faces hard and chapped by the wind. "This is private property now. Shaw," one of them called out, his voice thin against the wind. "Baron Hale's property. Best you and your friend turn back." "This trail is a public right-of-way," Elias countered, his voice a low growl. "And that spring serves more than just one ranch. You have no right to fence it." The rider spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "We have the right of this wire. The law's changing. Shaw, best you get used to it. Now move along before you trespass." Elias's hands clenched into fists. Tahan placed a steadying hand on his arm, his touch light but firm. A fight here, now, would be foolish. Outnumbered and out in the open. They stood their ground for a long moment, a silent battle of wills fought across the vicious barbs of the new fence. Finally, Elias gave a curt nod, and they turned back toward the cabin, the riders' smug laughter chasing them into the storm. Back in Sable Fork, May was sweeping the last of the day's mud and snow from the saloon floor. 2 of Hale's men, the same 2 who had been at the fence line earlier, were lingering over a last bottle of whiskey in the storeroom, their voices low and boastful. May, never one to ignore an opportunity for information, found a reason to stack crates nearby. Old Man Shaw looked like he'd swallowed a wasp. One of them chuckled. "He did not like our new fence one bit." "He will like it even less when the boss is done," the other said, his voice dropping. "That first map was just for the boundary, the one Cole Ransom drew up. The one in the safe. That one shows how to sink the dynamite. Divert the whole underground feed. The spring on Shaw's land will dry up by summer. He will have a valley of stone, just like the story says." May froze, her hand gripping a wooden crate so tightly her knuckles turned white. A second map. Dynamite. This was not about fencing off access. This was about destroying the spring entirely. When Elias and Tahan returned to the cabin, they brought the bone-deep cold of the storm and the grim reality of the fence with them. They found Maribel sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, Rosie asleep in her lap. She had stoked the fire, and its cheerful light danced on the log walls, pushing back the shadows. The room was warm and filled with the scent of coffee and baking bread. It was an island of life and hope in the middle of a war. Elias stood in the doorway, the melting snow dripping from his hat, and looked at the woman and his child, a tableau of peace that he now knew he would have to fight for with everything he had. The law of the range was being rewritten in sharp and rusty wire, and the only law that mattered now was the law of survival. The blizzard raged for another day, imprisoning them in the small log house. A strange, temporary domesticity settled over them. Elias and Tahan worked in the barn, mending tack and reinforcing a wall the wind had found a weakness in. Maribel, with a quiet competence that needed no instruction, took over the kitchen. She organized the pantry, baked bread that filled the small space with a warm, comforting aroma, and kept Rosie entertained with stories and shadow puppets on the wall. She moved through the house with a purpose that slowly began to push back at the heavy stillness, the lingering sense of absence. Elias watched her. He was a man who noticed details. He saw the efficient way she moved, the lack of any wasted motion. He saw the genuine warmth in her eyes when she smiled at his daughter. And he saw the shadow that crossed her face whenever she thought no one was looking. He had tried to ignore the connection, the name that had fallen like a stone in the saloon, but it was a splinter under his skin, a question he could not leave unanswered. Trust was a currency in this land, and he needed to know what kind of coin she carried. That evening, the storm finally broke. The wind died down to a low moan, and a sliver of moon cast a pale, ethereal light on the new world of snow. Rosie was asleep in her small bed, her breathing soft and even. Tahan was outside, his preference for the clear, cold air of the night, a constant. In the main room, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the hiss of melting snow dripping from the eaves. Elias sat cleaning his rifle, the methodical movements of his hands a counterpoint to the turmoil in his mind. Maribel was mending a tear in one of Rosie's dresses, her stitches small and neat. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. "In Sable Fork," Elias began, his voice low, not looking up from his work. "The postman said a name, Cole Ransom. You knew it." It was not a question. It was a statement. Maribel's needle paused in mid-stitch. She set the small dress aside, her hands folding in her lap. She had known this was coming. She had spent the last day composing and discarding explanations in her mind, searching for words that would not sound like an excuse or a plea for pity. In the end, she chose the simple truth. "I was engaged to be his wife," she said, her voice clear and steady, meeting his gaze across the small room. Elias's hands stilled on the rifle. "He came west 2 years ago," she continued, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He was full of promises, of land, of a new life. He was ambitious. He wrote about a powerful man he had met, a mentor who was going to make him rich, a man named Baron Hale." The name landed between them, heavy and cold. Elias said nothing, his face a granite mask, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. His letters were full of grand plans. Then they became less frequent, colder. He wrote of business, of delays. He stopped mentioning a future for us. The last letter came 6 months ago. Then, nothing. She took a slow breath. "I had already sold my father's house. I had purchased my ticket. I was coming west to build the life he had promised, with or without him. I did not come here to chase him, Mr. Shaw. I came here because I had nowhere else to go." The confession hung in the air, simple and unadorned. It was a story of betrayal, but she told it without a trace of self-pity. It was a fact, like the storm, like the fence Hale had built, a thing to be endured and overcome. Elias slowly resumed cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic scrape of the cleaning rod the only sound. He respected the honesty. He respected the strength it took to travel 2,000 miles into the unknown, chasing the ghost of a dead promise. But it did not change the fact that her past was now tangled up with the man who was threatening his future. Maribel reached into the small traveling bag at her feet. She pulled out a single, folded envelope. "I wrote this on the train," she said softly. A final letter, full of questions he would never answer and anger he did not deserve to hear. She held it for a moment, looking at the name written on the front in her own neat script. Cole Ransom. It looked like the name of a stranger. Then, with a decisive movement, she leaned forward and held the letter over the fire. The corner caught, turning brown, then black, before erupting into a small, bright flame. She did not let it go. She held it until the heat licked at her fingertips. Then she opened her hand and let the last, blackened scraps of her past drift down into the embers and vanish into ash. It was a quiet, profound act of severance. She was not just destroying a letter. She was burning a bridge, renouncing a claim, declaring her own independence. When she sat back, her face in the firelight was calm. The shadow was gone. Elias finished his work and set the rifle aside. He looked at her, and for the first time, the icy distance in his eyes thawed. Just a little. "A man is known by the company he keeps," he said quietly. "It seems your Mr. Ransom has chosen his—" Just then, the cabin door opened and Tahan entered, bringing a gust of cold, clean air with him. He had been checking the horses, his silent patrol a constant presence around the small ranch. He glanced at the two of them by the fire, at the tension that had eased but not disappeared, and seemed to understand. He added a log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "The old ones say water has a memory," Tahan said, his voice a low rumble as he stared into the flames. "You can build a dam. You can dig a new channel. You can lie to the river with shovels and rocks. But the water never forgets the way home. It remembers the cool shade of the cottonwoods, the smooth stones of its bed. It will wait, a season, a lifetime, and one day, it will return. The man who betrays the water will find his own well has run dry." His words settled into the quiet room, a parable that was also a prophecy. It was a warning about Hale, about his fences and his greed. But it was also a deeper truth about the nature of things. Betrayals, like diverted rivers, always seek a reckoning. The next morning, with the sun bright on the new snow, a rider approached the cabin. It was Jed, the young postman, his horse kicking up puffs of white as he rode. He was bursting with news, his face flushed with the cold and his own self-importance. "Mr. Shaw," he called out, dismounting before his horse had even fully stopped. "Official business. From the county seat. The whole territory is talking about it." He pulled a thick envelope from his satchel. "It is a notice. Baron Hale has filed a new claim on the entire Crow's Teat watershed. He says the original surveys from 20 years ago were flawed. He has presented historical documents, maps from old railroad grants." Elias took the envelope, his movement stiff. "They are sending a county surveyor out from Cheyenne next week," Jed continued, oblivious to the grim silence that had fallen. "To remeasure the boundaries, to reassess the water rights. They are going to draw a new map, Mr. Shaw, a legal map, and they are going to use Mr. Hale's paperwork to do it." Elias looked from the official document in his hand to the distant line of hills where his spring flowed, the lifeblood of his land. Hale was not just building fences anymore. He was rewriting the law. He was using paper and ink to steal what he could not take by force. And he was using the power of the county to bless the theft. The quiet declaration of war at the fence line had just become a full-blown invasion. And Elias Shaw knew he was standing on the losing side of the battle line. The official notice felt heavier than lead in Elias's hand. It was a declaration that the law, a force he had always believed to be impartial, had been bought and paid for by Baron Hale. There was no time to wait for a corrupt surveyor to sign away his lifeblood. His main herd, several hundred head of cattle, was in the lower pasture near the now fenced spring. He had to move them. Move them now, before Hale's men decided to expand their fence line and trap his stock completely. The only viable route to the high summer pasture and its reliable creek was across the old wooden trestle bridge that spanned Rattlesnake Gulch, a deep and jagged scar in the earth. It was a long, hard day's drive, but it was the only way. He gathered his 2 young ranch hands, Billy and Sam, boys who were more bone and grit than grown men. Tahan, without being asked, readied his own horse. His presence was a quiet statement of solidarity. They moved out at dawn, the rising sun casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Maribel stood at the cabin door, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching them go. She had packed food and filled their canteens, her movements efficient and her words few, but Elias had seen the worry in her eyes. The cattle were sluggish in the cold, their breath pluming in the still air. The drive was slow and arduous. By midday, they had pushed the herd to the edge of the gulch, and then they saw it, a thick column of greasy, black smoke rising into the clean, cold sky. It was coming from the direction of the bridge. "Stay with the herd," Elias ordered the boys, his voice a low growl. He and Tahan spurred their horses, galloping ahead. The smell of burning pine and something oily and chemical reached them long before they saw the flames. The bridge was an inferno. Great orange tongues of fire licked at the sky, consuming the thick timber supports as if they were kindling. On the far side of the gulch, 2 riders sat on their horses, silhouetted against the blaze, watching their work. They raised their rifles and fired a few casual shots into the air, a mocking salute. Elias reined in his horse so hard it reared, its whinny a sound of panic, rage, cold and pure, washed over him. This was not just a fence. This was not a legal document. This was a direct assault. Hail had just stranded hundreds of cattle, Elias's entire net worth, on a patch of land with no water. He was trying to break him, to starve him out in a single, brutal stroke. He and Tahan rode back to the herd. The cattle, smelling the smoke and sensing the agitation of the men, were becoming restless. They milled about, lowing with the first stirrings of thirst and confusion. Billy and Sam looked at Elias, their young faces pale with shock and fear. "What do we do?" Boss Billy asked, his voice cracking. "There is no other way across." "They will not last 2 days without water," Sam added, his gaze fixed on the rising smoke. Elias's mind raced, but every option was a dead end. The gulch was impassable. Turning back meant returning to land that was being systematically stolen from him. For a moment, he felt the sharp, bitter taste of defeat. It was Tahan who broke the silence. He had dismounted and was studying the rock face of the gulch. His eyes narrowed. He pointed to a place where the sheer cliff gave way to a steep, rocky incline, a place that looked like nothing more than a rock slide. "There is a way," he said, his voice calm and steady amidst the rising panic. "An old way, a game trail. The people used it to hunt sheep in the high country. It is narrow, it is dangerous." He turned his gaze from the cliff to Elias. "But it will lead to water." Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through Elias. He looked at Tahan, and in that moment, they were not just a rancher and a native guide. They were allies, commanders in a war that had just been declared on them. "Show us," Elias said. Tahan gave his orders, his voice carrying an authority that no one questioned. Sam was to ride back to the ranch, to let Maribel know what had happened and to bring back every canteen and water skin they had. Elias, Tahan, and Billy would start pushing the herd toward the hidden trail. Back at the cabin, Maribel had already seen the smoke. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, what it meant. When Sam came galloping into the yard, his horse lathered and his face a mask of panic. She was already in motion. She did not ask questions. She took command. She calmed the terrified boy, gave him a piece of bread and a drink of water, and then began to organize. She gathered the canteens, filled a large sack with bandages and a bottle of carbolic acid from the medicine chest, and wrapped up the remaining bread and dried meat. She was not the helpless bride from the train. She was a quartermaster preparing for a siege. The canyon trail was a nightmare. It was a thin, treacherous ledge, barely wide enough for a single cow, with a sheer drop on one side and a crumbling rock face on the other. The cattle, terrified of the uncertain footing and the dizzying height, balked. They lowed in protest, their hooves slipping on the loose shale. It took all the skill Elias and Billy possessed to push them forward, one agonizing foot at a time. Tahan moved ahead on foot, his buckskin-clad feet finding holds that seemed invisible. He cleared loose rocks from the path, his movements economical and precise. From the rim of the canyon above, a rifle cracked. One of Hale's men, left behind to watch the destruction, had spotted them. A bullet ricocheted off the rock face, sending stone chips flying. The herd panicked, threatening to stampede back the way they had come, or, worse, over the edge. Elias raised his own rifle, searching for a target. But Tahan's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear. "Do not shoot at the rocks. Shaw, they will shoot back with a landslide." Elias lowered his gun, understanding the wisdom in the words. He could not risk bringing the whole canyon wall down on them. They were exposed, vulnerable. They had to keep moving. They pushed on, the unseen riflemen taking pot shots at them, the bullets whining past their heads. It was a slow, terrifying ordeal, every step a gamble. Hours later, bruised, exhausted, and covered in dust, they emerged from the canyon into a small, hidden valley, and there, steaming in the cold afternoon air, was a pool of crystal-clear water, fed by a geothermal spring. The parched cattle surged forward, their desperate bellows giving way to the sounds of drinking. They had made it. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and purple, Elias and Tahan rode back to the smoldering ruins of the bridge. The fire had burned itself out, leaving behind a blackened, skeletal frame. The air was thick with the stench of charred wood and defeat. They dismounted and walked through the ashes, searching for answers. It was Tahan who found it. Tucked behind a rock near the bridge abutment was an empty 5-gallon drum, the source of the chemical smell. It had been used to carry the oil that had turned the bridge into an inferno. As Tahan rolled it over with the toe of his boot, something on its side caught the last of the light. It was a small, metal seal, partially melted but still legible. It bore the image of a single, unblinking eye, and a name that made Elias's blood run cold. Pinkerton National Detective Agency. This was not the work of a few hired thugs from a rival ranch. Baron Hale had employed the most notorious and relentless private police force in the country. He had the backing of men who operated with the tacit approval of railroads and powerful industrialists. Men who made their own laws. Elias looked at the smoldering bridge, then at the Pinkerton seal. The fight for his water, for his land, had just become a war against a far greater and more shadowy power than he had ever imagined. The discovery of the Pinkerton seal cast a long, cold shadow over the small victory at the hot spring. They had saved the herd, but they had also uncovered the true nature of the enemy they faced. Baron Hale was not just a greedy rancher. He was a man with connections, a man who could hire an army that operated beyond the reach of any local sheriff. Elias felt as though he were standing on a patch of dissolving ground, the solid world he knew crumbling into a morass of corruption and power. They spent a cold night camped by the spring, taking turns standing guard, though no one came. The next day, they drove the herd into the high summer pasture, a wide, sheltered meadow with a gurgling creek that would sustain them for weeks. The immediate crisis was over, but a sense of dread followed Elias and Tahan as they rode back toward the homestead. They arrived to find the world being erased again. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, had turned the color of slate. The wind had picked up, and fine. Hard pellets of snow had begun to hiss through the air. Another storm was rolling in, this one promising to be even more vicious than the last. They had no choice but to ride for the cabin and once again brace for a siege, not from armed men, but from the relentless, impartial fury of nature. For 2 days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the log house. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow drifted up past the windowsills, plunging the small cabin into a perpetual twilight. The fire was their sun, a crackling, spitting heart that held the immense cold at bay. The enforced confinement changed the currents between them. The urgency of the fight was replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of survival. In the evenings, the small room would grow quiet. Tahan would sit by the hearth, carving a piece of cottonwood with a small, sharp knife, his movements patient and deliberate. Elias would repair a broken harness, his large hands surprisingly deft with the needle and awl. Maribel would read to Rosie from a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales she had carried with her from the East, her voice a low, steady murmur against the shriek of the wind. On the second night of the storm, Rosie was too restless to sleep. She was tired of being inside, tired of the half-light and the constant noise of the wind. She tossed and turned in her small bed, her whines growing into fretful cries. Maribel went to her, stroking her hair and murmuring softly. But the little girl could not be soothed. Elias watched from his chair, a familiar ache in his chest. Sarah had always known how to calm Rosie, how to sing her into a peaceful sleep. It was a magic he did not possess. Then, Maribel began to sing. It was not a song Elias had ever heard before. It was a simple folk tune, a melody that spoke of green hills and gentle rivers, of a world 1,000 miles away from the harsh beauty of this land. Her voice was not powerful, but it was clear and true, filled with a sweet, aching melancholy. "Hush now, little darling, and close your eyes. The robin is sleeping, the sun has gone by, the river is dreaming a dream of the sea. And I will be dreaming, my darling, of thee." Elias stopped his work, the leather harness forgotten in his lap. He closed his eyes and just listened. The song was a balm on his raw nerves, a moment of pure, simple beauty in a world that had become ugly and hard. It conjured a phantom ache of memory, the ghost of Sarah's voice singing a different lullaby in this very room. But this time, the memory did not bring the sharp, stabbing pain of loss. It was a gentler sorrow, a sad warmth that spread through his chest. He heard the sound of a life he thought was gone forever, and found that it was not entirely unwelcome. He opened his eyes and looked at Maribel, who sat silhouetted by the firelight, her head bent over his daughter. And in that moment, he saw not a ghost, but a woman. By the time the last note faded, Rosie's fretful cries had softened into the deep, even breaths of sleep. Maribel quietly tucked the blankets around her and returned to her chair by the fire. The silence that followed was different, softer. "That was a beautiful song," Elias said, his voice rougher than he intended. Maribel looked up, a small, surprised smile touching her lips. "It was my mother's," she said simply. Later that night, the wind found a new way to torment them, rattling a loose shutter on the barn with a frantic, percussive rhythm that made sleep impossible. "I have to fix that," Elias muttered, pushing himself to his feet and pulling on his coat. "I will come with you," Maribel said, already reaching for her shawl. "I can hold the lantern." He started to object, to tell her to stay in the warm cabin, but he stopped. He found he did not want to go out into the howling dark alone. He simply nodded. The barn was a world of its own, warmer than the outside and filled with the comforting, earthy smells of hay, animals, and warm leather. The horses shifted in their stalls, their soft snorts and the rustle of their bedding a peaceful counterpoint to the storm. Maribel held the lantern high, its golden light casting huge, dancing shadows on the walls. Elias found the loose shutter and, with a few well-placed nails, secured it against the wind. The frantic rattling stopped, leaving only the low moan of the storm. For a moment, they stood in the relative quiet, reluctant to go back out into the cold. Elias walked over to check on his mare, who was due to foal in the spring. He ran a hand down her flank, murmuring softly. Maribel came and stood beside him, holding the lantern so he could see better. Their shoulders brushed, and neither of them moved away. The warmth of the small contact seemed to create a pocket of stillness around them. "You have a good home here, Mr. Shaw," Maribel said, her voice quiet. "It is just a place," he replied, his gaze still on the mare, wood and stone. "It is more than that. It is a place you are willing to fight for." She looked at him, her expression serious in the lantern light. "You still do not believe in luck?" Elias turned to face her. They were standing close enough for him to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. A small, wry smile touched his lips, a rare sight that softened the hard lines of his face. "I believe in work," he said, "and I believe in having enough rope and good horses." He paused, his gaze holding hers. As for luck, he looked away for a beat, as if weighing his words. "If you keep staying here, maybe it will stay, too." The admission, so indirect and grudging, was more powerful than any flowery declaration. It was a crack in the wall he had built around himself, a small concession to a feeling he was not yet ready to name. Maribel felt her breath catch. Before she could think of a reply, his hand came up, not to touch her face, but to gently brush a piece of stray hay from her hair. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. In that moment, their hands met, a brief, warm connection in the cold barn. It was not a gesture of passion, but of a deeper, quieter thing, of comfort, of recognition. A sudden, sharp knock at the cabin door shattered the spell. It was a sound so unexpected in the heart of the storm that they both started. They exchanged a look of alarm and hurried back, the lantern swinging wildly and throwing their shadows into a frantic dance. It was Jed. The young postman was covered in snow, his face raw from the wind, his horse standing behind him, trembling with exhaustion. "Jed, what in God's name are you doing out in this?" Elias demanded, pulling him inside. "Had to come," Jed panted, fumbling inside his coat. "May sent me. She said you had to know right away." He pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped message. "Cole Ransom is back in Sable Fork. He rode in an hour before the storm hit, and he is not alone. He is with some fancy-looking fellow from back east, a man in a city suit. May heard the man say he was an agent, here to finalize the new land survey, an agent for the railroad." The fragile warmth of the barn evaporated, replaced by an icy dread. Cole Ransom was back, and he had brought the full weight of the railroad's power with him. The fight was no longer a distant threat represented by a surveyor. It was here, now, in the form of a man from Maribel's past and a powerful agent who had come to legitimize Baron Hale's theft. The small light of hope that had been kindled in the barn flickered, threatened by the gathering darkness. The news Jed delivered sucked the last of the warmth from the cabin. Cole Ransom. The name was a tangible presence now, a third party to the fragile connection that had formed between Elias and Maribel in the lantern-lit barn. The air grew thick with things unsaid. Elias retreated behind the wall of stoic silence Maribel was beginning to know too well. His face was set, his eyes cold with the calculation of a man preparing for a fight on a new and unexpected front. The storm blew itself out by morning. When the pale sun finally broke through, it revealed a landscape transformed, buried under a deep, pristine blanket of snow. The beauty of it was a cruel joke. Elias announced his intention to ride to Sable Fork as soon as the trail was passable. He had to face this new threat, to see the railroad agent and Cole Ransom for himself, to try and find a weakness in the legal armor Hale was building around his theft. "I am coming with you," Maribel said. It was not a request. Her voice was quiet but firm. She had faced down a train robber and a blizzard. She would not hide from a ghost. Her past had caught up with her, and she would meet it on her feet, not cowering in another man's home. Elias looked at her, his expression unreadable. He wanted to refuse, to tell her it was his fight, that she would only be a complication, but he saw the resolve in her eyes, the same unbending strength that had allowed her to burn his letter, and he knew it would be useless to argue. He gave a single, curt nod. They left Rosie in the care of young Sam, with strict instructions to keep the doors barred and the rifle loaded. Tahan, as always, joined them without a word, his presence a silent promise of support. The ride to Sable Fork was slow, their horses struggling through the deep drifts. The world was quiet, muffled by the snow. But the silence between Elias and Maribel was a roaring thing, filled with the name of Cole Ransom. Sable Fork had been transformed. The arrival of the railroad agent had turned the sleepy outpost into a makeshift seat of power. Men from the Rocking H Ranch swaggered through the single street, their confidence bordering on arrogance. The saloon, which had been a haven, now felt like enemy territory. A notice had been nailed to the door, announcing a preliminary hearing on the Hale water claim, to be held in 2 days' time, right there in the main room. As they dismounted, a man stepped out of the saloon, and Maribel's breath caught in her throat. It was Cole. He was handsomer than she remembered, his features sharpened by the western sun. He wore a fine wool coat and a confident smile that did not quite reach his eyes. When he saw her, his smile widened, a practiced expression of delighted surprise. "Maribel," he said, his voice smooth and rich, as if they had only parted yesterday. I could not believe it when I heard, "What a remarkable coincidence." He ignored Elias and Tahan completely, his entire focus a calculated performance for her. Before she could answer, the railroad agent, a man in a crisp city suit that looked absurdly out of place, followed him out. "Ransom, we have business," he said impatiently. Cole held up a hand. "One moment. Mr. Davies, a dear friend from back home." He gave Maribel a look that was both an apology and a promise, then followed the agent back inside. The brief encounter left a sour taste in Maribel's mouth. She saw him for what he was, a man who had traded his integrity for a place at a powerful man's table. They spent the day in a tense state of limbo. Elias spoke with a few of the other small ranchers who had come to town, men whose faces were etched with the same worry that lined his own. They were all caught in the same net. Tahan disappeared, melting into the town's shadows, his eyes and ears open. Maribel found herself isolated, the object of curious stares and hushed whispers. She was the woman who had arrived on the arm of the town's grieving widower. And now her past had arrived in the form of a handsome stranger allied with their common enemy. Late in the afternoon, she sought a moment of peace outside. Away from the prying eyes and the thick smoke of the saloon, she was standing near the livery, watching the blacksmith work, when Cole found her. "I am sorry about that earlier," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "Mr. Davies is a man who values his time." He moved to stand beside her, his presence crowding her. "I have missed you, Maribel." "You have a strange way of showing it." "Cole," she replied, her voice cold. "No letters for 6 months is a silence that speaks very clearly." He had the grace to look away, a flicker of shame crossing his features before it was replaced by a look of earnest pleading. "I know, I was wrong. Things out here are more complicated than I could explain in a letter. Baron Hale has given me an opportunity, a real chance to make something of myself. I had to secure my position before I could send for you. I was going to, I swear it. You were going to let me know after you helped your new boss steal the land and water from the people who live here," she asked, her disbelief a sharp edge in her voice. His smile faltered. "It is not stealing, Maribel, it is business. It is progress. This is a new world, with new rules." He reached out and took her arm. She pulled it away as if she had been burned. "Do not do that," he said, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "I am trying to help you. I can still help you." "I do not want your help," she said, turning to leave. "You might," he shot back, his voice hardening. "Think about it. You are here with him." He jutted his chin toward the saloon where Elias was, a broken man hiding on a failing ranch. "What can he offer you? I can offer you a future. Baron Hale is going to own this valley. I will be his right hand. You can be by my side. All you have to do is say the word. We can put the past behind us, a new start." When she just stared at him, her expression one of utter contempt, his face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Or you can stay with him, and I can tell them all about you." About the mail-order bride who traveled 2,000 miles only to find her fiancé had moved on. They will laugh at him, Maribel, at the hearing, when he is trying to look like a respectable landowner. I will make sure everyone knows he took in a desperate, abandoned woman. They will see him as a fool, and a fool's testimony is worthless. It was then that Elias stepped out of the livery. He had gone to check on their horses. He had not heard the threat. He had not heard the talk of business or land. He had arrived in time to hear Cole Ransom say, "You can be by my side. All you have to do is say the word. We can put the past behind us. A new start." And he had seen the way Cole was standing too close to Maribel, his expression intense and pleading. The fragile trust that had been built in the quiet of the cabin, in the warmth of the barn, shattered. The world narrowed to that single damning scene. All his fears, all his grief, all the raw pain of betrayal he had buried with his wife, came rushing back. He saw a man from Maribel's past offering her a future, and he saw a hesitation in her that was not there. His pride, a fierce and wounded thing, rose up like a wall of ice. He did not say a word. He simply turned, his face a thundercloud, and strode back toward the saloon. Maribel saw the look on his face, and her heart sank. She saw the instant misunderstanding, the immediate, painful judgment. For a second, she thought to run after him, to explain the ugliness of what Cole had said. But her own pride, scoured raw by Cole's threats, held her back. She would not plead. She would not beg him to believe her over the evidence of his own eyes. If he could not trust her, then nothing she could say would matter. She lifted her chin and watched him go, a cold sense of finality settling over her. Elias pushed his way into the saloon and went straight to the bar. He ordered a whiskey and took it to a small, scarred table in the corner, a table covered in the carved initials and knife marks of 100 forgotten arguments. He stared into the amber liquid, the whispers of the room fading into a dull roar. He had been a fool to let his guard down, a fool to feel a flicker of hope. He had let a stranger into his home, into his daughter's life, and she was no different than the man who had promised her everything and given her nothing. Tahan found him there minutes later. He slid onto the bench opposite Elias, his presence a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil in the room and in Elias's soul. He said nothing for a long time, simply watching the other man. "You did not see it all," Tahan said at last, his voice low. "I saw enough," Elias bit out. Tahan shook his head slowly. A man who looks at half a map will walk off a cliff. A man who listens to half a story will condemn an innocent person. He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes holding Elias's. To hear the whole story is a sign of respect, to the story, and to yourself. Before Elias could answer, Tahan's hand moved. He slid a small, folded piece of paper across the scarred surface of the table. It was a receipt from the general store, dated that afternoon. It was for a case of expensive whiskey, a box of cigars, and a cash payment of $200. It was made out to the county surveyor, and at the bottom, in a bold, arrogant script, was the signature of Baron Hale. The surveyor had gotten drunk and careless. Tahan had not been. He had seen the paper fall from the man's coat pocket as he stumbled out into the street. Elias stared at the receipt. It was proof of bribery, a tangible piece of Hale's corruption. It was a weapon. But as he looked at it, he felt no triumph. He felt only the cold, bitter weight of his own half-truth, and the chasm that had just opened between him and the woman he had so quickly, and so wrongly, condemned. The bribery receipt lay on the scarred table between them, a flimsy piece of paper holding the weight of a kingdom. It was proof, cold and absolute, but it brought Elias no satisfaction. Tahan's words echoed in his mind, a quiet indictment of his own hasty judgment. A man who listens to half a story will condemn an innocent person. He had let his own ghosts, his own pride, blind him. He had looked at Maribel and seen not the woman who had faced down bandits and blizzards, but a reflection of his own deepest fears of betrayal. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was about to speak, to try and put words to the tangle of regret and anger in his gut. When the saloon doors burst open, it was young Sam, the ranch hand he had left to guard Rosie. The boy was breathless, his face sheet white with terror, his chest heaving. "Mr. Shaw," he gasped, stumbling forward. "It is Rosie. She is gone." The world stopped. The low hum of the saloon, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation. It all vanished. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his hands gripping the boy's shoulders. "What do you mean? Gone?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "A man came," Sam stammered, tears welling in his eyes. "He said he was a friend of Miss Clark's. He had a kind voice. He said she had sent him to bring Rosie to her. I did not think to question." The boy's voice broke. "He took her. He rode east, toward the old railroad spur." Cole Ransom. The name was a venomous certainty in Elias's mind. This was not about business or pride anymore. This was a violation. Cole had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had taken his child. A primal rage, cold and clean and absolute, settled over Elias. It burned away the shame and the confusion, leaving only a single, deadly purpose. He turned, his eyes meeting Tahan's across the room. The Apsa'aluk warrior was already on his feet, his rifle in his hand. No words were needed. Tahan had seen the boy's terror, had heard the name of the destination. He knew. Maribel entered the saloon at that moment, her face pale but composed. She saw Sam crying, saw the look on Elias's face, and a terrible understanding dawned. "What is it?" she whispered, though she already knew. "He has her," Elias said, his voice flat and hard. "Ransom has Rosie." Maribel's composure shattered. A strangled cry escaped her lips, and her hands flew to her mouth. This was her fault, her past, a creature she thought she had escaped, had reached out and stolen the most innocent thing in this new world. "He is forcing your hand," Tahan said to her, his voice cutting through her panic. "He will use the child to make you go with him. He will be heading for the iron bridge over Crocodile Gulch. It is the only way east from the old spur line." There was no more time for talk. Elias was already moving, his long strides eating up the floor of the saloon. He grabbed his coat and rifle, his movements economical and lethal. Maribel, her face a mask of desperate resolve, was right behind him. They burst out into the street, the cold air a shock. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and a vicious wind was whipping through the town, picking up snow and turning it into a blinding curtain. A storm of ice and sleet was bearing down on them. They galloped out of Sable Fork, 3 riders against the storm, chasing a ghost who held the most precious thing in the world. The iron railroad bridge at Crocodile Gulch was a skeletal finger pointing across a terrifying void. It was a relic from a failed railroad venture, a monument to greed that spanned a chasm hundreds of feet deep. The wind shrieked through its iron trestles, a sound like a soul in torment. Sleet, sharp as needles, drove down from the sky, coating everything in a treacherous, gleaming sheet of ice. In the middle of the bridge, they were waiting. Cole Ransom sat on his horse, a small, bundled figure held tightly in front of him. Rosie, beside him, a second man waited, a large, impassive figure in a city coat, the Pinkerton agent. He held a rifle with a casual ease that spoke of long and violent practice. Elias, Tahan, and Maribel reined in their horses at the edge of the chasm. The sight of Rosie, so small and vulnerable in Cole's grasp, sent a fresh wave of ice through Elias's veins. "That is far enough. Shaw!" Cole shouted, his voice thin against the gale. "You see, Maribel, I told you there was a simpler way, a new start, just you and me." "Let the girl go." "Cole!" Maribel screamed, her voice torn away by the wind. "She is my insurance," Cole yelled back. "You come across alone. You give me your word you will ride with me, and I will give the child to Shaw. It is that simple." Elias started to move forward, his rifle coming up, but Tahan's hand on his arm stopped him. "He is a coward," Tahan said, his voice low and calm, a cornered animal. "He will hurt the child if you rush him." Maribel looked from Cole's desperate face to Rosie's terrified one. She saw the Pinkerton agent, his rifle aimed squarely at Elias. This was her play to make, her courage, her choice. She swung down from her horse. "I will come," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she did not feel. "I will come with you. Cole, just let her go first. Let her go to her father." She began to walk forward, her boots slipping on the icy planks of the bridge. The wind tore at her, trying to push her back, but she kept moving, her eyes locked on Rosie. Cole hesitated, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "How do I know this is not a trick?" "Because you know me." "Cole," Maribel said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that was more chilling than any threat. "You know I always wanted a new start. You are offering one." She took another step. "Let the child go. She is nothing to you. I am what you want." She was buying time. She was moving the focus, drawing his attention, creating a space for something to happen. She saw Elias's hand tighten on his rifle, saw Tahan uncoiling a thin, braided leather rope from his saddle. Cole's ego, his vanity, won out. He believed her. He nodded curtly, and with a rough movement, he pushed Rosie off his saddle and onto the bridge. "Go on," he snarled at the child. "Go to your father." Rosie, crying and terrified, stumbled on the icy planks. For a heart-stopping moment, she almost fell. Then she scrambled up and ran, a small, desperate figure, toward Elias. The moment Rosie was clear, the world exploded into motion. As Elias scooped his daughter into his arms, the Pinkerton agent swung his rifle toward him. But Tahan was faster. The leather rope in his hand sang through the air, a blur of motion. It wrapped itself around the rifle's stock and barrel with a sharp snap. Tahan yanked, and the rifle was torn from the agent's hands, clattering onto the ironwork of the bridge. At the same instant, Elias, with Rosie held secure in one arm, raised his pistol. Cole, his face a mask of fury and betrayal, drew his own gun, aiming it wildly. "Drop it! Ransom!" Elias roared over the storm. A sudden, deep boom shook the entire structure, a sound that came from beneath them. A tremor ran through the iron bridge. A support on the far end, near the Pinkerton, gave way with a screech of tortured metal, plunging into the abyss. Dynamite. The bridge was rigged. Cole's eyes went wide with panic. He fired, not at Elias, but wildly, a shot of pure fear. Elias did not fire back. "Is that your shot?" "Cole!" he yelled, his voice a blade of contempt. "Are you shooting at me or at your own cowardice?" The words hit their mark. Cole's face crumpled, the arrogant mask falling away to reveal the weak, frightened man beneath. Another explosion, louder this time, erupted from directly under the center of the bridge. The planks buckled. The Pinkerton agent, seeing the game was over, made a run for the solid ground he had just left, abandoning Cole without a second glance. The bridge was dying. It groaned and twisted, shedding bolts and rivets that pinged into the chasm below. Cole, his horse screaming in terror, lost his footing on the heaving planks. He scrambled for a hold, his gun sliding away from him. He looked at Elias, his eyes begging. Another section of the bridge gave way. Maribel, who had thrown herself flat, grabbed Rosie's coat and pulled the child into her arms, shielding her with her own body. "We have to go," Tahan shouted, already pulling his horse back from the crumbling edge. Elias, still holding Rosie, reached for Maribel, his hand clamping onto her arm. He pulled them both back, step by agonizing step, as the iron structure tore itself apart behind them. Cole Ransom let out one last, terrible cry as the section of the bridge he was on tilted, hung in the air for a second, and then plunged into the howling, sleet-filled darkness of Crocodile Gulch. They reached solid ground just as the last of the bridge tore away from the abutment and followed the rest of its length into the chasm. Its death scream swallowed by the storm, they stood there, the four of them, huddled together on the edge of the abyss, gasping for breath. The wind and sleet whipped around them, but the immediate danger was gone, the toxic past. The man of broken promises had been consumed by the very chasm he had tried to use as a trap. Elias looked at Maribel, who was holding his daughter in a fierce, protective embrace. And in the heart of the storm, he finally saw the whole story. The ride back from Crocodile Gulch was a slow, grueling affair. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean and buried in silence. They were all soaked to the bone, chilled by more than just the wind. Rosie, wrapped in Tahan's dry blanket, was asleep in Elias's arms, her small face peaceful for the first time in hours. Elias looked over at Maribel, who rode beside him, her face pale and etched with exhaustion. The chasm that had opened between them in Sable Fork had been bridged, not by words, but by shared terror and a common purpose. The half-story he had seen was a meaningless fiction compared to the whole truth he had witnessed on that bridge. They did not speak. There were no words for what had happened, for the man who now lay at the bottom of the gulch, for the child who had been used as a pawn. The silence was a heavy thing, but it was not the angry, mistrustful silence of before. It was a shared quiet, a space to breathe, to absorb the terrible cost of their survival. When they reached Sable Fork, the town was in an uproar. News traveled fast in the high country. The Pinkerton agent had ridden straight back, not to Baron Hale, but to the railroad agent, Mr. Davies, babbling about dynamite and a bridge collapse. He was a hired gun, not a loyal soldier, and his only concern was saving himself. May had already spread the word about the bribery receipt. The flimsy foundations of Baron Hale's power, built on intimidation and corruption, were beginning to crumble. The hearing, which was supposed to be a formality to rubber stamp Hale's claim, was now a full-blown inquest, with no official courthouse. The town's small wooden church was chosen as a neutral ground. The circuit judge, a weary man named Wallace, who had been stranded by the storm, agreed to preside. It was to be a hearing of the people, a makeshift court of frontier justice. The church was packed. Ranchers and townsfolk filled the rough-hewn pews, their face grim and expectant. Late afternoon sun slanted through the tall, narrow windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Baron Hale sat at a table at the front, flanked by his lawyer and the railroad agent, Mr. Davies, who looked profoundly uncomfortable. Hale's face was a mask of arrogant indignation, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Elias, Maribel, and Tahan sat on the opposite side. The bribery receipt and the melted Pinkerton seal lay on the table before them. The judge began, his voice dry as dust. He listened first to Hale's lawyer, who spoke of legal surveys, of historical claims, of the necessities of progress. It was a speech polished by money and arrogance, and it fell flat in the quiet church. Then, Elias was called to speak. He did not talk about his own claim. He simply placed the Pinkerton seal on the judge's desk. "This was found in the ashes of the bridge my cattle needed to cross," he said, his voice low and steady. "A bridge that was burned to trap my herd and starve them out." Next, May took the stand, her expression defiant. She told the court what she had overheard in her storeroom. They spoke of dynamite, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. Of a second map, of drying up Crow's Teeth Spring for good, leaving a valley of stone. Finally, Tahan was called. He walked to the front of the church, his presence a quiet rebuke to the loud assertions of Hale's lawyer. He did not speak of stories or legends. He placed the receipt for the whiskey and the $200 on the table. This fell from the coat of the county surveyor. He said, "A man who came to measure the land with a bottle in one hand and Baron Hale's money in the other." A low murmur went through the room. The evidence was undeniable. The pieces fit together into a single, ugly picture of greed. corruption, and violence. Judge Wallace looked at Baron Hale, his weary eyes missing nothing. He looked at the railroad agent, who suddenly found the floor fascinating. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, his voice cold, "these are grave accusations. Arson, bribery, conspiracy, and what sounds very much like attempted murder by stranding men and stock. We also have the matter of a kidnapped child and a man who is now missing, presumed dead." He picked up his gavel. "This court finds that your claim to the Crow's Teat watershed is based on fraud and intimidation. The public right-of-way will be restored. No man may fence that water. As for you, sir, you are under arrest." Hale surged to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. You have no authority but two stout ranchers, deputized on the spot, moved to his side, and the fight went out of him. He was a man whose power had just evaporated, leaving only a bitter, defeated old man in its place." As Hale was led away, a profound sense of relief settled over the room. The fight was over. The water was safe. In the quiet that followed, Elias stood up. He did not look at the judge or the crowd. He looked directly at Maribel. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the church. "Before this is over," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide, "I have something to say. On this matter, I am also guilty. I listened to half a story. I saw with my eyes, but not with my heart. And I judged a good and brave woman wrongly." He took a slow breath. "Maribel, in front of all our neighbors, I ask for your forgiveness. I was wrong. I am sorry." The apology, so public and so simple, was devastating in its sincerity. Maribel felt a stinging in her eyes, but she did not look away. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. At that moment, Rosie, who had been sitting quietly beside her, slid off the pew and wrapped her small arms tightly around Maribel's waist, burying her face in her dress. The entire church saw the gesture, a child's simple, loving claim. The judge, a man not without a sense of the moment, cleared his throat. "This community needs to protect its resources," he announced. "I propose the formation of a Sable Fork Water Board to ensure fair access for all. I think Elias Shaw would be a good man to lead it." He paused, his gaze falling on Tahan. "And I think a man who knows the land better than any survey, a man who sees what others miss, should be on that board as well. Tahan, would you serve?" A surprised silence fell over the room. It was an unprecedented offer. Tahan looked at the judge, then at the faces of the ranchers in the pews. He saw not suspicion or hatred, but a new, grudging respect. He gave a slow, dignified nod. "I will serve," he said. The last piece of business was Maribel. The judge looked at her with a kind weariness. "Miss Clark," he said gently, "you have been through a terrible ordeal. You are a witness in a serious matter. Do you have a statement you wish to make?" Maribel stood, Rosie still clinging to her. She looked at the faces of the people who had been strangers just a few days ago. "I only want to say one thing," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Freedom is not something you ask for. It is something you work for." As the meeting broke up, a palpable sense of hope filled the air. May slapped Elias on the back, a wide grin on her face. "Well, Shaw," she boomed, "that was quite a show. Now, who is paying for all the victory drinks that are about to be consumed at my saloon?" Just then, Jed the postman pushed his way through the crowd, waving a telegram. "It is for the whole town," he announced. From the territorial office in Cheyenne. Judge Wallace took the paper and read it aloud. It stated that, in light of recent events, the railroad was abandoning its spur line through Crocodile Gulch. However, recognizing the community's need for a safe crossing, the territory had approved a joint project. The destroyed iron bridge would be replaced by a small, sturdy earthen dam and a low-water crossing. The territorial government would provide the engineers and equipment. The labor, it said, was to be provided by the citizens of the Sable Fork Valley, a joint effort between the ranchers and their absolute neighbors. A cheer went up in the small church. Out of the fire and the flood, a new community was being forged, not by barbed wire and fraudulent claims, but by the promise of shared work, a shared future, and a shared belief that justice, like water, must be available to all. A week later, as the first stars began to prick the deep violet of the evening sky, the entire valley gathered at Crow's Teat Spring. A great bonfire roared in a ring of stones, its light pushing back the immense darkness of the high plains and painting the faces of the assembled people in flickering shades of gold and red. The air was crisp and cold, scented with sagebrush and burning pine, the sound of the spring itself. A constant, gentle gurgling was the heartbeat of the gathering. This was not a party in a saloon, with its low ceilings and stale air. This was a celebration of the land itself, of the water that gave it life. Billy, the young ranch hand, sat on a log and played a lively tune on his harmonica, a sound that was pure frontier, full of hope and hardship. And from the other side of the fire, an Apsaluk elder answered him, the rhythm of a hand drum a deep, resonant pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself. The two sounds, so different in origin, wove together in the night air, creating a new kind of music, a song of a community finding its harmony. Maribel sat on a blanket with Rosie nestled against her side, the little girl's eyes wide with wonder at the dancing flames. She was no longer a stranger, a piece of driftwood washed up by a storm. In her lap was a new leather-bound ledger. The first entry, written in her neat, clear hand, was the founding charter of the Sable Fork Water Board, with the signatures of every rancher in the valley, and the carefully drawn mark of Tahan beside them. She was the keeper of their shared future. Elias stood near the fire, speaking quietly with the other ranchers. He was not a different man, but some of the deep, weary sorrow had lifted from his shoulders. He laughed at a joke May told, a real, unburdened sound that made Maribel's heart ache in a good way. He was the head of the water board, but he had insisted Maribel be its secretary and treasurer. You see the story the numbers tell, he had said to her, a quiet acknowledgement of her skill and his trust. He did not seek to protect or possess her. He stood beside her as an equal. When the music paused, Tahan rose. The firelight carved his strong features out of the darkness. All eyes turned to him. I have told the story of Crow's Teat, he began, his voice a low rumble that carried in the still air. How the water is the blood of the earth. But there is another part to this story. It is not just about the land. It is about us. He looked around the circle of faces, his gaze lingering on Elias, then on Maribel. The old ones say that people are like the water. We have a memory. We remember the kindness that gives us shade. We remember the harsh rocks that block our way. If you treat a person with greed, if you try to dam up their heart with fences of wire and fear, their spirit will grow bitter and the land around them will turn to dust. He held up his hands, palms open to the fire. But if you treat them with respect, if you share the path, if you believe that there is enough for all, their spirit will run clear and strong. It will nourish everything it touches. He looked at the faces around the fire, a mix of white settlers and his own Apsaluk people. The water has chosen to stay here, in this valley, because we have chosen to share it. We have remembered the way home, together. A respectful silence followed his words, a moment of shared understanding that was more profound than any applause. Later, as the fire burned down to a glowing bed of embers and people began to gather their sleepy children, Elias came and sat down on the blanket beside Maribel. He was quiet for a long time, watching the stars. A river of diamonds spilled across the blackness. Rosie was fast asleep, her head in Maribel's lap. I have been thinking, Elias said at last, his voice low and for her alone, about my wife, Sarah. For 2 years, I have tried to keep her memory perfect, like a thing in a glass box. I thought that if I let anyone else in, it would tarnish it, that if I felt something new, it would be a betrayal. He picked up a small, smooth stone, turning it over and over in his calloused hand. But that is not how memory works, is it? It is not a thing you keep. It is a thing that lives inside you. It becomes a part of the man you are. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were clear and filled with a raw, honest light. "I cannot forget the past," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never forget her, but I choose to learn how to love you in the present." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring of worn gold, a single tiny seed pearl embedded in its face. It was his mother's. "This is not a promise of an easy life," he said, his voice rough. "There will be storms and there will be droughts, but I will stand with you, if you will have me." Tears welled in Maribel's eyes, hot and cleansing. This was not a fairy tale. This was not a grand passion. It was something better. It was real. It was a choice, made by a man who knew the cost of loss and was still brave enough to open his heart. She held out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Just then, Rosie stirred in her sleep. She blinked her eyes open, looking from her father's face to Maribel's, a sleepy, confused frown on her face. Then, her expression cleared, and a slow, delighted grin spread across her lips. "Now I am sure of it," she announced in a loud, clear whisper that carried in the quiet night. "My mommy, she looks just like you." A ripple of soft, warm laughter spread out from the people still lingering by the fire. It was not a laugh of sadness or pity, but a laugh of pure, simple joy. The wound had healed. The ghost was at peace. As Elias helped Maribel to her feet, his hand warm and strong in hers, Tahan came over to them. He was preparing to leave, to take a group of the young Absolute boys on their first journey to the summer valleys, teaching them the stories of the land, ensuring the old ways would not be forgotten. He was a bridge, not just between two cultures, but between the past and the future. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder and gave a single, deep nod of approval. Elias looked out across the valley, at the dark shapes of the mountains against the star-dusted sky. His land, his family, his future. He felt a profound sense of peace. For a moment, his eyes were drawn to a high ridge in the distance, against the stars. He thought he saw a flicker of movement, the silhouette of a lone rider on a horse, watching them from the darkness. It was there for a second, a fleeting, uneasy shape, and then it was gone. Coal. A trick of the light he did not know, but it did not matter. Whatever ghosts lingered in the hills, he would face them. He was not alone anymore. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.